In the autumn of 1944, as Allied armies raced across France faster than any force in modern warfare, they encountered an enemy more dangerous than Wehrmacht divisions: distance itself. Rails were twisted rubble, ports lay miles behind the front lines, and fuel drums stacked uselessly on Normandy beaches. Victory would not be decided by firepower alone, but by the unglamorous arithmetic of ton miles, and by the thousands of men driving six-wheeled trucks through the night, delivering not glory, but survival. September 2nd, 1944, 30 miles east of Paris. The tanks sat silent. Third Army spearheads, which had crossed France in 26 days, faster than Napoleon, faster than any mechanized force in history, now idled in mud with their engines cold. Fuel gauges read empty. Ammunition racks were half filled. The Moselle River lay 30 miles ahead, and beyond it, the Siegfried Line. Between the American advance and Germany's western wall stood only disorganized remnants of a retreating enemy, and 6 hours of gasoline. The silence was unnatural. Patton's columns had roared east with such momentum that German commanders believed they faced twice the actual force. Tank treads had chewed through villages so quickly that French civilians waved American flags at dust clouds. Now, those same treads rested in fields of trampled wheat, motionless as monuments. Officers checked their maps against reality and found the gap unbridgeable. The railheads that should have followed the advance were still 100 miles west. Bridges lay in the rivers they once crossed, twisted steel and splintered wood, foamed by explosive charges the Wehrmacht had triggered in retreat. Ports like Cherbourg were operational, but their cranes lifted cargo onto beaches, not trains. Fuel drums stacked in Normandy might as well have been on another continent. The logistics officers spoke in a language of impossibility. Ton miles, turnaround time, depot distance. Every term measured the same crisis. The Allied advance had broken its own supply line. Eisenhower's planners had anticipated reaching the German border by May 1945. It was September 1944, and they had already arrived, without the infrastructure to sustain what they had won. In a command tent lit by kerosene lamps, a lieutenant traced 2 thin lines across a French road map with his finger. Highway routes, one-way corridors. He marked them with a painted circle, a red ball, borrowed from railroad freight priority symbols. The plan was absurd. Replace an entire railroad network with trucks, tens of thousands of trucks, moving day and night, no stops, no exceptions. Someone laughed and called it suicide logistics. By evening, the first convoys were already forming. Private Louis Red Carter of the 452nd Truck Company stood beside his GMC six-wheeler and taped over the headlights with blackout strips, leaving only thin cat-eye slits for illumination. The medal of St. Christopher, patron saint of travelers, was glued to his dashboard, its metal face catching the last daylight. Around him, other drivers did the same, taping lights, checking tire pressure, securing loads with chains that sang in the wind when pulled tight. They were black soldiers, most of them. The U.S. Army had segregated them into service units, quartermaster companies, truck battalions, labor details, roles the system valued least. Now those same units were being tasked with the most critical mission of the campaign: keep the front moving or watch it die. Red checked his fuel load. 55-gallon drums, stacked and strapped. Gasoline sloshed inside the steel with a sound like distant surf. He had driven supply runs before, short hauls from depot to depot, regulated and safe. This was different. The orders were explicit. No stopping except for breakdown, no lights except cat eyes, no mercy for mechanical failure. Disabled trucks would be pushed into ditches. Loads would be transferred on the move. The convoy did not pause. Across the staging area, Corporal Marie M.P. Alvarez stood at a crossroads in white gauntlets that glowed against the dusk. She was military police, and her job was singular: make the road obey. 2 highways had been requisitioned, one north, one south, and turned into one-way arteries. Civilian traffic was frozen. French vehicles sat parked in village squares, their drivers watching American trucks roll past in columns that stretched beyond sight. Marie raised one hand, and an entire convoy stopped. She dropped it, and they moved. The road ruled all, and she was its enforcer. Lieutenant Harold Stein, Quartermaster Corps, stood in a depot tent surrounded by requisition forms that no longer mattered. Fuel was not the only scarcity. Tires, tubes, bearings, rubber and steel components were failing under loads the trucks were never designed to carry. GMC six-wheelers were rated for 2.5 tons. They were being loaded with 5. Axles groaned. Suspensions sagged. Blowouts happened every mile. Stein had calculated the mathematics of collapse. Each truck needed reserves, 2 spare tires, 4 spare tubes, grease for bearings that overheated on long hauls. Rubber was as precious as ammunition now. He told his sergeants the truth in one sentence. "We don't run on gasoline. We run on tires." By nightfall, the first convoy rolled. Engines ignited in sequence, a mechanical chorus that started at the front and rippled backward for miles. Cat-eye headlights flickered on, tiny yellow slits against the dark, almost invisible from above. The spacing between vehicles was measured in seconds, too close, and a single breakdown would cascade into gridlock, too far, and the column would stretch into vulnerability. The road became a river of dimmed light flowing east. Red Carter gripped the wheel and felt the GMC lurch forward under its load. The truck protested. Springs compressed, engine laboring, but it moved. Behind him, another set of cat eyes appeared. Behind that, another. The column folded into itself, a single organism made of steel and rubber and exhausted men. No one cheered. No photographers waited at the roadside. Fighter aces earned headlines and medals. Truck drivers earned derision, and the nickname that would define them, just trucks. But 30 miles ahead, Patton's tanks waited in silence, and the Red Ball Express had begun to roll. Fuel remaining for Third Army, 72 hours. August 25, 1944. 1 week earlier, Paris had fallen without a siege. The liberation came so quickly that German commanders abandoned their headquarters with coffee still warm on the desks. Champagne flowed in the streets. Civilians embraced soldiers who barely had time to stop. Photographers captured the moment. Tanks draped in flowers, rifles held overhead in triumph. The Eiffel Tower framed against smoke that rose not from battle, but from celebration. But in the logistics depots west of the city, the celebration felt premature. Quartermaster officers stood over maps that showed the gap widening between supply and demand. The Allied armies had planned for a methodical advance, capture ports, repair railroads, establish depot networks, then push forward in measured stages. D-Day planners had projected reaching the Seine by D+90. They had reached it by D+80 and showed no signs of slowing. The problem was not courage or firepower. It was distance. Every mile the front advanced added another mile to the supply line. Trucks that once made a 6-hour round trip from Normandy beaches to forward positions now drove for 20 hours. Fuel consumed in transit began to equal fuel delivered. The system was eating itself. General Omar Bradley's staff calculated the requirements. Third Army alone needed 400,000 gallons of gasoline per day just to sustain its advance. Multiply that by First Army, by British and Canadian forces, by the logistical tail that fed them all, and the numbers became surreal. Railways could move such tonnage. Trucks could not, or so the doctrine insisted. Yet the railroads were gone. The French rail network had been systematically destroyed, first by Allied bombing campaigns designed to isolate Normandy, then by retreating German engineers who demolished bridges, tore up tracks, and mined the rights-of-way. Repairing a single rail line took weeks. Building a new bridge required engineer battalions that were already overstretched at the front. Ports offered little relief. Cherbourg had been captured in late June, but German demolitions left it nearly useless. Cranes were toppled into the harbor, quays were cratered, mines floated in the approach channels. Engineers worked around the clock, but restoration was measured in increments. A few hundred tons one week, a few thousand the next. It was not enough. Meanwhile, the front kept moving. Patton's Third Army crossed the Seine on August 20th and aimed for the Moselle. First Army pivoted north toward Belgium. Montgomery's forces surged toward the Dutch border. Each commander demanded priority for fuel and ammunition. Each believed his axis of advance would end the war by Christmas. Eisenhower, supreme commander, faced an impossible equation. He could not supply everyone at full capacity. Someone would have to wait. Someone would have to stop. The decision was tactical, but the consequences were existential. Slow the advance and the Wehrmacht would recover. German forces were retreating in chaos, but chaos could be reorganized given time. Fortress cities could be reinforced. The Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive wall, could be manned. Every day of delay handed Hitler another day to consolidate. But push too hard, and the spearheads would simply run dry and become targets. In a headquarters briefing, a colonel proposed the unthinkable: bypass the railroad entirely. Dedicate entire truck companies to a single mission: fuel delivery, around the clock, on exclusive routes with military priority. Treat the highways like a railroad without tracks. Call it express service. The reaction was skepticism edged with desperation. Trucks were auxiliary, railroads were doctrine. But doctrine required infrastructure, and the infrastructure was rubble. On August 29th, the orders went out. 2 highways running from Normandy to the front would be requisitioned for military use only. 1 lane north, 1 lane south. Convoys would run continuously, day and night, with priority over all other traffic. Staging areas would function like rail yards. Loads assembled, vehicles inspected, drivers briefed on routes they would memorize in the dark. The operation was given a name borrowed from railroad terminology: Red Ball, the symbol freight companies used to mark high-priority shipments. A painted red circle on a white background. Simple, visible, absolute. In the motor pools, the work began immediately. Thousands of GMC six-wheelers, the workhorses of the U.S. Army's supply fleet, were pulled from general duties and assigned to dedicated companies. Mechanics swarmed the vehicles, checking engines, replacing worn parts, greasing axles that would be pushed beyond rated limits. Tires were inspected for tread depth and sidewall cracks. Anything marginal was replaced. There would be no second chances on a blacked-out highway at midnight. Private Red Carter learned about his assignment from a sergeant who handed him a clipboard and a map, with 2 red lines drawn across France. "You'll drive this route every day," the sergeant said. "Sometimes twice a day. No stopping unless you break down. No lights except cat eyes, no radio chatter. You follow the truck in front of you and you don't lose sight of his taillights." Red studied the map. The route stretched over 200 miles one way, 400 round trip, on roads that were farm lanes a month ago, through towns that might still have German stragglers, in blackout conditions that turned every curve into a gamble. He asked the only question that mattered: what if we can't make it? The sergeant looked at him without sympathy. Then the front stops, and men die waiting for you. Corporal Marie Alvarez received her orders with equal brevity. She would command a traffic control point at a critical junction 50 miles east of the start line. Her job: keep the convoys moving, no matter what. French civilians would be stopped. Allied units not part of Red Ball would be stopped. Generals would be stopped if they tried to cross during convoy hours. The road ruled all, and she was its enforcer. She practiced the gestures in a mirror: raised palm for stop, dropped arm for go, pointed finger for direction. The white gauntlets were not decoration. They were visibility. In the dark, in the rain, in the dust thrown by 100 trucks, those gloves would be the only signal drivers could see. Lieutenant Stein dealt with the mathematics of failure. Trucks would break down. Tires would blow. Engines would overheat. Accidents would happen. His job was to ensure that every breakdown did not become a catastrophe. He established recovery teams, wreckers positioned every 20 miles, spare parts stockpiled at intervals. Mechanics trained to work in blackout conditions by touch and memory. Disabled trucks would be pushed off the road immediately. Loads would be transferred to the next available vehicle. The convoy would not stop. He also requisitioned something unexpected: mattresses. Drivers would need to sleep between runs, and sleep deprivation would kill more efficiently than enemy fire. Rest areas were designated, staffed with cooks and medics. 12 hours on the road, 6 hours rest, then back on the road. The cycle would continue until the front no longer needed them, or until they collapsed. By September 1st, the system was ready to be tested. That night, the first full convoy assembled in the staging area near Alençon. 500 trucks, loaded with jerrycans of gasoline, arranged in a column that stretched back into the darkness. Engines idled, exhausts pluming white against the cold air. Drivers sat behind the wheel and waited for the signal. Red Carter checked his load one last time. 55-gallon drums, 20 of them, strapped down with chains. The weight made the truck squat on its suspension. He touched the St. Christopher medal on the dashboard and whispered a prayer he had learned from his grandmother. At 2200 hours, the lead vehicle moved. The convoy followed like a chain being pulled taut. Cat-eye headlights appeared in sequence, dim yellow slits that seemed to float in the void. The spacing held. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, close enough to follow, far enough to react. The road swallowed them whole. By dawn, the first trucks would reach the forward depots. By noon, they would turn around and drive back. By midnight, they would do it again. The Red Ball Express was no longer a plan. It was a machine, and it had begun to run. Fuel remaining for Third Army, 48 hours. September 5th, 1944, Highway 301, approaching Chartres. The convoy moved through rain that turned the road into a black mirror. Cat-eye headlights reflected off wet pavement, doubling and fragmenting until the column seemed to move through a tunnel of shifting light. Windshield wipers beat a rhythm that synced with the engine's pulse. Red Carter leaned forward, squinting through the rain-streaked glass, following the taillights of the truck ahead. 2 red dots that occasionally vanished behind curtains of water, then reappeared like distant stars. His hands ached. 12 hours on the wheel, gripping hard enough to feel every pothole through the steering column. The GMC's suspension was gone, worn flat by loads it was never designed to carry. Every bump transmitted directly into his spine. His back throbbed, his shoulders burned, but he did not stop. The rule was absolute. Disabled trucks were pushed aside, loads transferred on the move, and the convoy continued. Red had seen it happen twice already on this run. A blown tire, the truck lurching into the ditch, recovery crews appearing out of the darkness with jacks and wrenches. The disabled vehicle was cannibalized in minutes. Fuel drums rolled onto another truck, driver reassigned, wreckage abandoned. The convoy did not pause. He glanced at the fuel gauge, half empty. Enough to reach the depot and return to the staging area, if he did not idle, did not detour, did not waste a single drop. Fuel was not just cargo now. It was survival. Every gallon delivered to the front was a gallon that could not be used for the journey itself. The arithmetic was brutal. The round trip from Normandy staging areas to forward depots measured over 400 miles. A GMC six-wheeler consumed roughly 1 gallon every 6 miles under load. That meant burning 67 gallons just to deliver 1,000 gallons forward. The efficiency was terrible, but it was the only efficiency available. Records from the Transportation Corps would later reveal the scale. At peak operation, the Red Ball Express moved more than 12,500 tons per day. Over its 82 days of operation, it would deliver nearly 400,000 tons of supplies, predominantly fuel, across distances that should have required railroads. It was not elegant, it was not efficient by peacetime standards, but it worked. Ahead, the taillights flared bright, brake lights. Red eased off the accelerator and felt the truck's momentum drag against the wet road. The convoy was slowing. Something blocked the route. Through the rain, he saw the silhouette, a Bailey bridge spanning a river that had swollen beyond its banks. Engineer Corps had assembled the span in less than 48 hours, working under intermittent artillery fire from German units still retreating across the countryside. The bridge was narrow, 1 lane reinforced for heavy loads, but not designed for continuous traffic. Corporal Alvarez stood at the bridge approach, white gauntlets raised. The rain had soaked through her uniform, but the gloves still glowed in the headlights. She directed each truck onto the bridge with precise gestures. Forward, stop, forward again. The spacing had to be perfect. Too many vehicles on the span at once, and the structure would fail. Red watched her work. No hesitation, no wasted motion. The road ruled all, and she enforced that rule with nothing but a raised hand and the authority of necessity. He rolled forward when signaled, felt the truck's tires transition from pavement to steel grating. The bridge vibrated under the weight, a hum that rose through the frame and into his chest. Below, the river churned brown with runoff. He kept his eyes on the far side and did not look down. 30 seconds later, he was across. The convoy resumed speed. The rain eased into mist. By the time dawn broke, they were approaching the forward depot, a field of tents and fuel drums guarded by a handful of MPs who looked as exhausted as the drivers. Red backed his truck into the unloading zone and climbed down. His legs nearly buckled. 12 hours sitting, and now his body did not remember how to stand. A quartermaster sergeant directed the offload. Drums rolled down ramps, stacked onto pallets, marked with chalk for dispersal to tank battalions, and mechanized units waiting in assembly areas miles ahead. Lieutenant Stein was there, clipboard in hand, counting every drum. His face was gray with fatigue, but his count never faltered. 55, 56, 57, he muttered, marking each line. When the last drum hit the ground, he signed the manifest and handed it to Red. "Turn around in 4 hours," Stein said. "Get some sleep." Red nodded, too tired to speak. He walked to the rest area, a row of cots under a canvas tarp, and collapsed without removing his boots. Around him, other drivers did the same. Some snored immediately. Others stared at the canvas overhead, too exhausted to sleep, too wired to rest. 4 hours later, the whistle blew, and they climbed back into their trucks. The return trip was lighter but no easier. Empty trucks bounced harder on bad roads. Fuel burned just as quickly without a load. The cat eyes still slitted the darkness. The rain returned. By September 10th, the numbers had clarified into a verdict. Intelligence reports compiled by Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force indicated that Patton's Third Army had advanced over 200 miles in 2 weeks, sustained not by railroads, which still lay inoperable, but by continuous truck convoys running 24 hours per day. Fuel delivery rates, previously limited to depot turnaround times, now matched frontline consumption. The Wehrmacht had noticed. German radio intercepts captured confusion and disbelief. American units were attacking positions that intelligence had deemed unreachable due to supply constraints. Tank columns appeared where fuel should not exist. The logistics were impossible, and yet they were happening. One intercepted message, decoded weeks later, summarized the German perspective with unintentional clarity. Enemy advance continues despite destroyed rail infrastructure. Resupply method unknown. Forward units report continuous vehicle movement on priority routes. The method was known. It was just unbelievable. The Red Ball Express had become the circulatory system of the Allied advance. Highways were veins, trucks were blood cells, fuel was oxygen, and the organism kept moving because its parts refused to stop. Corporal Alvarez stood at her junction and directed the 500th convoy with the same precision as the first. Her white gloves were stained with road dust and rain, but they still caught the headlights. Drivers knew her by reputation now. The MP who never stopped traffic for anything less than a breakdown or an ambush. Once a general's staff car had approached the junction during convoy hours. Alvarez raised her hand. The staff car stopped. The general's aide stepped out and explained rank, urgency, priority. Alvarez pointed to the red circle on the road sign and said only, "The road rules all." The staff car waited. Private Carter completed his 50th run on September 14th. He had driven over 20,000 miles in 2 weeks. The St. Christopher medal was still glued to the dashboard, though the adhesive had started to fail, and the medal tilted at an angle. He pressed it flat with his thumb and kept driving. His tires were bald, his engine knocked, his suspension was non-existent. Mechanics told him the truck had maybe one more round trip left before it needed to be pulled from service entirely. He made 6 more trips after that. Lieutenant Stein's calculations had proven accurate in the worst way. Rubber was failing faster than steel. Tires blew out every 10 miles on average. Tubes ruptured under pressure. Bearings seized from heat and friction. His depot consumed spare parts at a rate that outpaced resupply. He requisitioned everything. tires from anti-aircraft units, tubes from field hospitals, grease from tank battalions. He traded, begged, stole. The trucks had to keep moving, and movement required maintenance that the system could barely provide. By mid-September, over 6,000 trucks were committed to Red Ball operations. They moved in shifts, in waves, in continuous cycles that blurred night into day. Drivers lost track of time. Some could not remember what day it was. Others could not remember their last meal, but they remembered the rule. Keep rolling. The front did not stop. Third Army crossed the Moselle. First Army pushed toward Aachen. British forces reached the Dutch border. Every mile gained was a mile delivered by trucks that should have failed but did not. The numbers told a story the headlines ignored. Millions of ton miles moved without railroads, ports operating at a fraction of capacity, armies advancing faster than doctrine allowed. It was not supposed to work. It worked anyway. Fuel remaining for Third Army, 24 hours. September 15th, 1944. Bridge at Commercy. The bridge was not supposed to exist yet. Engineer battalions had been working for 60 hours straight, assembling a Bailey span across the Meuse under conditions that redefined desperation. German artillery still ranged the site, shells landing in the water every 20 minutes, throwing up geysers that soaked the work crews. Spotters called corrections over field radios. Engineers bolted steel sections together by flashlight and prayer. The convoys were stacking up behind the river. 30 kilometers of trucks, nose to tail, engines idling, fuel burning for nothing. Every hour of delay was an hour of waste. Gasoline consumed without delivery, tires wearing without motion, drivers exhausted without purpose. Corporal Alvarez stood at the staging point and counted the headlights stretching back into darkness. 500 trucks, maybe more. She had stopped trying to get an accurate count after the column disappeared beyond the horizon. Her orders were clear. The moment the bridge opened, push them through. No spacing, no caution, maximum flow. The engineers had given her a window, 90 minutes. 90 minutes to move a convoy that should take 4 hours under normal conditions. After that, the bridge would be closed for inspection and reinforcement. If the trucks did not cross in time, they would sit until morning, burning fuel, losing time, failing the mission. She checked her watch. 02:30 hours. The bridge was scheduled to open at 0300. Behind her, Private Red Carter sat in his cab and felt the truck shudder as the engine idled rough. The knocked bearing was getting worse. Mechanics had told him it would seize completely within 100 miles. He had already driven 200 since that diagnosis. The St. Christopher medal had fallen off the dashboard. He picked it up and held it in his palm, feeling the warmth of metal that had absorbed hours of sunlight during the day. Patron saint of travelers. He needed that protection now more than ever. Around him, other drivers climbed out of their cabs and stretched. Some urinated by the roadside. Others smoked cigarettes cupped in their hands to hide the glow. A few just sat on the running boards and stared at nothing, too tired to move, too wired to rest. A sergeant walked down the column, passing word. Bridge opens in 30 minutes. When it does, you roll hard. No stopping, no slowing. If your truck breaks down on the span, you push it off into the river. Understood? Red nodded. Around him, others nodded. No one spoke. At 02:58 hours, a green flare arced over the river. Corporal Alvarez dropped her arm and pointed forward. The lead truck lurched into motion. Behind it, the entire column came alive. A 30-kilometer chain pulling taut. Engines roaring, exhausts smoking, headlights forming a river of dim yellow light. Red shifted into gear and felt the truck lunge forward. The knocked bearing screamed. He ignored it and kept his foot on the accelerator. The bridge appeared ahead, steel framework silhouetted against the night, lit by portable floodlights that the engineers had not yet dismantled. The span looked fragile, skeletal. A ladder laid across a chasm. Red could see the river below through the gaps in the decking. He did not slow down. The truck hit the bridge at 40 kilometers per hour. The steel sang under the weight, a high metallic note that rose and fell as the tires crossed each section joint. The entire structure vibrated. Red felt it through the wheel, through the seat, through his chest. The bridge was alive and protesting. Behind him, the next truck followed. Behind that, another. The spacing collapsed to almost nothing, trucks so close that their bumpers nearly touched. The engineers had said the span could handle 5 trucks at once. There were already 8. Red kept driving, his hands locked on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the far side. The bearing was shrieking now, a metal-on-metal scream that cut through the engine noise. He could smell burning oil. Halfway across, a truck 3 vehicles behind him blew a tire. The sound was like a gunshot. The truck swerved, clipped the guardrail, and stopped sideways across the span. Traffic behind it compressed instantly. Horns blared. Drivers shouted. The convoy was gridlocked in the middle of the bridge. Alvarez was already running. She reached the disabled truck in seconds, climbed onto the running board, and looked inside. The driver was dazed but unhurt. She pointed to the river. "Push it off." The driver stared at her. "What?" "Push it off the bridge, now." Recovery crews appeared from the darkness, troops assigned specifically for this scenario. They unhooked the load, rolled the fuel drums onto the next truck in line, then positioned themselves at the disabled vehicle's bumper. 6 men, shoulders to steel, pushing a 2.5-ton truck toward the edge of the bridge. It teetered for a moment on the guardrail, then tipped. The splash was enormous. The truck vanished under the black water and did not resurface. The convoy resumed. Red crossed the far side of the bridge at 03:02 hours, 14 minutes into the 90-minute window. Behind him, the column was still flowing, a continuous stream of headlights and engine noise and exhaust smoke that turned the night into a manufactured dawn. He did not stop to watch. He followed the road east, into the dark, toward the depot that was still 40 miles ahead. Meanwhile, in the operations tent at Supreme Headquarters, the logistics officers were arguing. The Red Ball Express had succeeded beyond projections, but it was eating itself alive. Truck attrition was catastrophic, 30% mechanical failure rate within the first month. Tires were being consumed faster than factories could produce them. Drivers were collapsing from exhaustion. The system worked, but it was not sustainable. Eisenhower's staff presented alternatives. Prioritize rail repair, slow the advance, consolidate supply lines. Every option required time, the one resource the campaign could not afford. Across the Atlantic in Washington, the War Department received reports that contradicted every pre-war assumption about logistics. Tonnage moved by truck had exceeded tonnage moved by rail for 3 consecutive weeks. The motor transport fleet, dismissed as auxiliary before the war, was now the primary method of supply delivery in the European theater. Doctrine was being rewritten in real time, but doctrine did not drive the trucks. Men did. Private Carter reached the forward depot at 05:10 hours. His engine was smoking. The bearing had finally seized, locking the drive shaft. He coasted the last 100 meters on momentum and came to rest in the unloading zone with the engine dead. Mechanic looked under the hood and shook his head. "This truck's done." Red climbed down and touched the St. Christopher medal one last time. He had driven this vehicle for over 30,000 miles in 3 weeks. It had carried fuel to tanks that broke through German lines, ammunition to artillery that shattered bunkers, rations to infantry that held ground no one thought they could reach. The truck had no name. It had no glory. It was marked only with a serial number and a painted red circle. It had done its job. Lieutenant Stein arrived at the depot with a new manifest and a grim expression. The Red Ball Express would continue for another month, maybe 2, until the ports were fully operational and the railroads restored. But the cost was visible now. Trucks lined up for repair that would never be completed. Drivers sleeping in shifts so short they barely qualified as rest. Tires stacked in piles that shrank faster than they grew. He had calculated the final mathematics. The Red Ball Express would move close to 400,000 tons before it ended. It would consume thousands of trucks, tens of thousands of tires, and the health of every man who drove the routes. But it would deliver victory. By September 20th, Patton's Third Army was across the Moselle and engaging the Siegfried Line. First Army had reached Aachen. British forces were pushing into the Netherlands. The advance that should have stalled in early September was still moving in late September, sustained by a logistics network that had replaced railroads with rubber and doctrine with desperation. The German High Command issued new assessments. American supply capabilities had been underestimated. The advance was sustainable. Defensive strategies would need to account for enemy forces operating beyond predicted logistical ranges. No one mentioned the trucks. No intelligence report identified the Red Ball Express by name. The system was invisible to the enemy, just as it was invisible to the press, to the public, to history being written in real time. But the drivers knew. Red Carter stood beside the wreckage of his truck and watched the next convoy roll past. Cat-eye headlights in the pre-dawn gloom. Engines laboring under loads they were never meant to carry. Men driving routes they had memorized in the dark. He saluted as they passed. None of them saw him. They were too focused on the road ahead, on the taillights in front of them, on the mission that allowed no rest and accepted no failure. The Red Ball Express kept rolling. Fuel remaining for Third Army. 12 hours. November 16th, 1944. Red Ball Express officially suspended. The last convoy rolled at 2100 hours. The trucks moved in silence, broken only by engine noise and the scrape of worn tires on pavement. No ceremony marked the occasion. No speeches were given. The drivers simply completed their final runs, delivered their loads, and returned to staging areas where mechanics were already stripping the vehicles for parts. 82 days of continuous operation. Nearly 400,000 tons delivered. Over 6,000 trucks committed at peak strength. Millions of ton-miles moved across highways that had been farm roads 3 months earlier. The front had not stopped. That was the only metric that mattered. But the cost was carved into the faces of men who climbed down from their cabs and walked like old men despite being in their 20s. Hands that trembled from vibration damage. Backs that would never fully straighten. Eyes that could not focus on anything that was not a road stretching into darkness. Private Red Carter stood in the motor pool and watched his company's trucks being cannibalized. Engines were pulled for depot use. Tires were removed and sent forward as spares. Frames were marked for salvage. The vehicles that had crossed France multiple times per day were now worth more as parts than as complete machines. He still carried the St. Christopher medal in his pocket. The adhesive had finally failed completely, and the metal had worn smooth from handling. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, a nervous habit he would carry for the rest of his life. A reporter from Stars and Stripes approached the motor pool that afternoon, looking for a story. He interviewed a lieutenant who spoke about tonnage and turnaround times. He photographed a line of trucks waiting for maintenance. He asked if any drivers were available for comment. The lieutenant pointed to Red. "That one made over 100 runs, ask him." The reporter approached with a notebook. "What was it like?" Red looked at him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Just trucks." The reporter waited for more. Red had nothing else to say. The article never ran. What the reporter did not understand, what most people would never understand, was that the Red Ball Express represented a moral inversion as stark as its logistical achievement. The U.S. Army was segregated. Black soldiers were systematically assigned to labor and service roles, deemed unfit for combat positions, valued least by the institution they served. And then that same institution had depended on them to sustain the most critical advance of the war. The 452nd Truck Company, the 514th, the 666th, nearly 75% of Red Ball drivers were black soldiers assigned to quartermaster units because the system believed they belonged nowhere else. They had been given the mission everyone dismissed as unglamorous, dangerous only in its tedium, important only when it failed. They had made it decisive. Corporal Marie Alvarez received a commendation for her service at the traffic control points. The citation mentioned efficiency, discipline, and adherence to protocol. It did not mention the generals she had stopped, the convoys she had pushed through impossible conditions, or the fact that her authority, derived solely from white gauntlets and an unwavering belief in the mission, had controlled the flow of an entire campaign. She kept the citation in a drawer and never showed it to anyone. Lieutenant Harold Stein compiled the final statistics in a report that would be filed and forgotten. Peak daily tonnage, 12,500 tons. Total fuel delivered, millions of gallons. Truck losses, over 2,500 vehicles rendered inoperable. Tire consumption, incalculable. He included a single sentence of editorial commentary. This operation succeeded not despite its improvisation, but because of it. His superiors struck the sentence before filing the report. Official doctrine did not acknowledge improvisation. It acknowledged planning, execution, and results. The results were undeniable. By November 1944, the ports were operational. Railroads had been restored to partial capacity. Supply lines had caught up with the front. The emergency that had birthed the Red Ball Express had passed. But the lesson remained, carved into the roads themselves. Victory had not come from superior firepower alone. The Wehrmacht had excellent tanks, disciplined infantry, defensive positions that should have been unbreakable. What they did not have was the arithmetic of supply, the unglamorous mathematics of ton miles and turnaround times, of rubber that refused to fail and men who refused to stop. They were defeated not by tanks, but by ton miles. Not by strategy, but by logistics. Not by doctrine, but by drivers who followed cat-eye headlights through the dark and delivered the fuel that turned movement into conquest. A painted circle beat a fortress. A crankshaft proved more decisive than artillery. Victory arrived on 6 wheels. The German military academies had trained officers in tactics, maneuver, operational art. But they had not trained anyone to counter an enemy whose supply system was a river of trucks flowing continuously, day and night, regardless of doctrine or expectation. Intelligence reports captured after the war revealed the extent of German miscalculation. Field commanders had assumed American logistics would collapse under the strain of rapid advance. They had planned defensive strategies around that assumption. They had positioned forces to counterattack when the Allied spearheads inevitably ran out of fuel. The fuel never ran out. Across the Atlantic, in factories that had retooled for war production, the lessons were already being integrated. Motor transport would no longer be auxiliary. Logistics would no longer be background. The next war, if there was a next war, would be fought with the understanding that supply lines were as critical as front lines. But in the autumn of 1944, that understanding was still forming, still unwritten, still visible only to the men who had lived it. Private Carter returned to his barracks and slept for 18 hours. When he woke, he could still feel the vibration of the wheel in his hands. He would feel it for months. Some nights he would dream he was driving, following taillights that stayed just out of reach, pushing forward into darkness that never ended. Other drivers had similar dreams. They did not talk about them. Corporal Alvarez was reassigned to traffic control in a rear area depot. The work was quiet, regulated, and safe. She found it unbearably boring. She requested transfer back to forward operations and was denied. MPs were needed in the rear. She spent her off-duty hours polishing the white gauntlets until they shone like new, even though she would never use them again. Lieutenant Stein was promoted and transferred to a planning staff in Paris. He brought his statistics with him and used them to lecture junior officers on the realities of logistics. Most of them did not believe the numbers. Truck convoys could not move that much tonnage. The system should have collapsed. He showed them the manifests, the fuel delivery logs, the maintenance records. The evidence was irrefutable. One young lieutenant asked the question that defined everything. How did they do it? Steen thought about the drivers sleeping in shifts, the mechanics working by touch in blackout, the MPs directing traffic with nothing but hand signals, the quartermasters rationing rubber like ammunition. He gave the only answer that mattered. They refused to fail. By December, the war had shifted again. The Battle of the Bulge opened, and suddenly the same roads the Red Ball Express had used became critical arteries for counterattack. Supplies flowed north instead of east. Trucks that had been retired were pulled back into service. Drivers who had thought they were done climbed back into cabs and drove through ice and snow and German ambushes. The system had proven itself once. Now it had to prove itself again. And it did. The painted red circle, the symbol that had been dismissed as signage for just trucks, became shorthand for something larger. Priority, discipline, necessity, the absolute refusal to let the mission fail regardless of cost. Years later, historians would argue about the decisive factors in the European campaign. They would debate strategy, leadership, technology, firepower. Some would mention logistics in footnotes, but the drivers knew. The MPs knew. The mechanics and quartermasters knew. The loudest weapon had no barrel, only a crankshaft, a clutch, and a bearing that refused to fail. They had been jeered at, dismissed, assigned to the mission nobody wanted because they were the soldiers nobody valued. And they had turned mockery into distance, distance into momentum, and momentum into the advance that broke an empire. The most unbreakable walls were not made of steel, but of belief. Belief that the front would hold. Belief that supply would arrive. Belief that somewhere behind the lines, in the dark, in the rain, through exhaustion and breakdown and all the friction war could generate, someone was driving. Someone was always driving. The Red Ball Express had rolled for 82 days. Its legacy would last far longer. Fuel remaining for Third Army, 6 hours, May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The war ended on a Tuesday. Church bells rang across liberated cities. Crowds gathered in streets still scarred by shrapnel. Soldiers embraced strangers. Photographers captured the moment, flags waving, champagne flowing, faces lit with relief that looked almost like disbelief. In a motor pool outside Paris, the celebration was quieter. Private Red Carter sat on the running board of a truck that was no longer his and listened to the announcement crackling over a field radio. The voice was distant, formal, official. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Hostilities would cease at midnight. The European theater was won. Around him, other drivers listened in silence. Some smiled. A few wept. Most just sat and let the news settle into their bones. News that meant they would not die tomorrow, that the road ahead no longer led into darkness, that the mission was finally, irrevocably complete. Red reached into his pocket and pulled out the St. Christopher medal. The medal was warm from body heat, worn smooth from months of handling. He held it up to the light and watched the sun catch the engraved surface. Patron saint of travelers. He had traveled farther than he ever imagined, not in distance alone, but in understanding what distance meant. A sergeant walked through the motor pool, shaking hands, offering congratulations. When he reached Red, he paused. "You made over 100 runs on the Red Ball. That true?" Red nodded. "Damn," the sergeant said softly. "They should give you a medal for that." Red looked at the St. Christopher medal in his palm and smiled. "Already got one." Across the depot, Corporal Marie Alvarez stood at a junction that no longer needed her. The convoys had stopped weeks ago. The roads were open to civilian traffic again. French farmers drove tractors past the faded red circle painted on the road sign, a symbol they had learned to respect, even if they never fully understood it. She removed her white gauntlets for the last time and folded them carefully. They were stained with road dust, worn thin at the fingertips, but they had never failed her. She placed them in her duffel bag alongside her commendation, and a photograph of the junction where she had directed 500 convoys through conditions that should have made passage impossible. Someone asked if she would keep the gloves as a souvenir. She said she would keep them as a reminder. Lieutenant Harold Stein received orders to return stateside for demobilization. Before leaving, he compiled a final addendum to his Red Ball Express report, a document he knew would be filed and forgotten, but one he needed to write nonetheless. He described what the statistics could not capture: the sound of engines in the dark, the smell of burning rubber, the sight of cat-eye headlights stretching to the horizon. He wrote about drivers who memorized routes they could not see, mechanics who repaired trucks by touch, MPs who controlled traffic with nothing but discipline and will. He concluded with a single paragraph that his superiors would never read. The Red Ball Express succeeded because it had no choice. Failure meant the front would stall, men would die waiting, and the war would extend into another winter. So the trucks rolled and the drivers drove, and the system that should have collapsed held together through sheer refusal to quit. History will remember tanks and generals. Those who were there will remember trucks and the men who drove them. He signed the document, sealed it in an envelope, and filed it with the Transportation Corps' archives. 50 years later, a historian would find it and weep. The painted red circles faded from the roads. Rain and time erased them. The highways returned to civilian use. Towns that had watched convoys pass every night returned to silence. The war became memory, and memory became history, and history became the stories people told when they wanted to explain how the impossible had been achieved. Most of those stories mentioned Normandy, the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine. Few mentioned the Red Ball Express. Fewer still mentioned the names of the men who drove it. But in the archives, the numbers remained. 400,000 tons delivered. 6,000 trucks committed. Millions of ton-miles moved across highways that had been farm roads. 82 days of continuous operation that turned a logistical crisis into the fastest sustained advance in military history. The numbers told a truth that headlines never captured. Wars are not won by the weapons that fire, but by the systems that supply them. Glory follows the charge, but victory follows the supply line. Heroes earn medals for seconds of courage. Anonymous soldiers earn nothing for months of endurance. Red Carter returned home to Georgia in the summer of 1945. He found work as a truck driver, long-haul freight, interstate routes, deliveries that measured hundreds of miles. His family asked if the work reminded him of the war. He said it did not. Civilian driving had rest stops, daylight, and roads without cat-eye discipline. It was easy by comparison. But sometimes, late at night when the highway stretched empty ahead and the tail lights of distant trucks appeared in the darkness, he would feel the old rhythm return. The spacing, the discipline, the absolute certainty that stopping was not an option because someone, somewhere, was depending on him to keep moving. Those nights he would touch the St. Christopher medal he kept on the dashboard and remember what it meant to be part of a machine that refused to fail. Corporal Alvarez became a traffic officer in Los Angeles after the war. She was good at her job, efficient, fair, uncompromising. Drivers complained she was too strict. Her supervisors said she had standards. She never told them about the white gloves, the convoys, or the night she pushed 500 trucks across a bridge in 90 minutes, because the mission allowed no alternative. She did not need to explain. The work spoke for itself. Lieutenant Stein became a professor of logistics at a state university. He taught supply chain management, transportation theory, and the mathematics of distribution. His students found him demanding but fair. His exams were notorious for their difficulty. He began every semester with the same lecture. He would draw 2 lines across a map of France, mark them with a red circle, and ask, "How do you move 400,000 tons without railroads?" Most students answered with theories. A few answered with calculations. None of them answered with the truth. You move it by refusing to accept that it cannot be moved. On the last day of class, he would show them the photographs. Trucks lined nose to tail, cat-eye headlights in the darkness, drivers sleeping on cots between runs, MPs in white gauntlets, mechanics working by flashlight. He would tell them, "This is what logistics looks like when failure is not an option." Some students understood. Most did not. But every year, a few would approach him after class and ask for the full story. He would give them the file, the statistics, the manifests, the testimony of men who had lived it. And he would tell them, the Red Ball Express was not supposed to work. It worked anyway. That is the only lesson that matters. Decades passed. The veterans aged. The trucks were scrapped. The roads were repaved. The war became history, and history became the distant past. But the symbol remained. In military museums, a painted red circle on white background sits behind glass. The placard explains, "Priority Freight Designation, World War II." It does not explain the nights, the miles, the exhaustion, the refusal to quit. It does not need to. Those who know, know. And those who drove, who gripped the wheel through rain and dark and breakdown, who followed cat-eyes into the unknown, who delivered victory 1 ton-mile at a time, they carry the knowledge like a medal that cannot be worn, but will never be lost. The most unbreakable walls were not made of steel, but of belief, and the red ball drove straight through them, not with thunder, not with fire, but with the quiet, relentless rhythm of engines that would not stop, drivers who would not quit, and a mission that allowed no room for failure. Just trucks, just men, just the distance between impossible and done. And in that distance, a war was won.